She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her trunk sat unopened beside her. The man who'd promised to meet her never came, and the whole town of Caldwell Creek watched her sit on that bench like she was already a ghost. On the third morning, when she'd finally stopped looking down the tracks, a quiet rancher stepped onto that platform, looked at her like she was worth something, and said 2 words nobody had said in days. Come home. If you've ever been left behind by someone who should have stayed, this story is for you. Subscribe, drop your city in the comments, and let's find out together just how far this story can travel. She pressed her last coin into her palm and held it so tight the edge left a mark in her skin. That was the moment Evelyn Harper understood she was alone. Not the kind of alone that passed by morning. Not the kind that a good night's sleep and a warm cup of coffee could fix. This was the kind of alone that settled into a person's bones and stayed there cold and quiet and permanent, like the empty tracks stretching west out of Caldwell Creek Station. She had counted the trains. 7 since she arrived. 7 departures, 7 arrivals, and not once had a man named Thomas Reed stepped off any of them. The bench she sat on had warped from years of summer heat. The wood pressed into the backs of her thighs through the thin fabric of her traveling dress, and the dress itself. The blue one she'd sewn by candlelight back in Virginia, because Thomas had written that blue was her finest color, had gone gray with dust and sweat. Her hair, which she'd pinned so carefully the morning she boarded the eastbound connection 3 weeks ago, now hung loose at her temples, and she had stopped caring about that somewhere around the second day. Around her, the station lived its ordinary life with no regard for hers. Men hauled freight from the cargo car. A woman with a small boy pulled him close when they passed Evelyn, as if the sight of a woman sitting alone on a bench for 3 days was something a child ought not to see too closely. The station master, a thick-necked man named Pruitt, had stopped making eye contact with her entirely. He'd asked her twice on the first day whether she was expecting someone. Both times she'd said yes. Both times he'd nodded and gone back inside. He hadn't asked a third time. The merchants along the far end of the platform whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. She could hear. Same woman from yesterday. And the day before. Nobody coming for her, you think? Appears not. Shame. Not shame enough to offer her a glass of water. Not shame enough to come sit beside her and ask her name. Just shame enough to talk about her in low voices while they counted their coins and arranged their goods and went about the business of being people who belonged somewhere. Evelyn had believed once that she was that kind of person too. She'd been a school teacher in Hargrove County, Virginia, not a grand life, but a full one. She had her classroom, her 31 students, a small rented room above the miller's widow, and the letters. Thomas Reed's letters arriving every 3 weeks with the regularity of seasons, each one warmer than the last. He'd written about his ranch outside Caldwell Creek, about the land that went on forever, about how a woman with her patience and her intelligence was exactly the kind of woman Montana Territory needed. I need you, he'd written in the last letter. Come west. I will be at the station the first Tuesday of July. We will begin our life properly. She had given notice at the school. She had packed her trunk. She had said goodbye to the widow who'd pressed a jar of preserves into her hands and told her to eat on the train and not let any man see her cry if the cars got rough. The first Tuesday of July had come and gone. So had the second. This was now the 3rd morning of the 4th week of July, 1884, and Thomas Reed had not come. Evelyn opened her palm and looked at the coin again. 1 dime. She'd managed the rest of carefully, a biscuit and coffee. The first morning, nothing. The second, because she hadn't wanted to spend what she might need, a piece of hard bread from a boy who'd offered it from his lunch pail the afternoon of the second day, with the guileless generosity of children who haven't yet learned to withhold. She'd thanked him so formally that he'd blinked at her and run back to his mother. Now she had 1 dime and a trunk full of a life that no longer had a destination. She thought about Virginia. About whether the widow would take her back. About whether the school board would consider reinstating her position, or whether she had made herself into too much of a cautionary tale. The spinster teacher who went west chasing a letter and came home with nothing. She thought about her parents both gone to fever 3 years ago, which was why she'd been so willing to leave. No roots in Virginia, except the ones she'd planted herself, and she'd been willing to uproot all of them for a man she'd never met in person. Foolish, she told herself. Unforgivably foolish. She did not cry. She had done her crying on the first night alone in the corner of the waiting room after Pruitt had locked the main doors and told her she could sleep inside, but she'd need to be gone by first light. She had sat against the wall in the dark and cried until her chest hurt, and then she had wiped her face and told herself that she was done with that. She was mostly done with that. The morning sun climbed higher. Evelyn watched a hawk circle above the roofline of the station, slow and patient, riding the updraft without moving its wings. She envied it. Not the freedom exactly, but the certainty the hawk knew exactly what it was looking for and exactly how to look. She heard the horse before she saw it. A single horse walking, not rushing. The sound of hooves on packed dirt moving up the road that ran alongside the station. She didn't look up immediately. Horses came and went through Caldwell Creek at all hours. But something about this one's pace made her lift her eyes after a moment. The rider was tall even on horseback. Dark coat despite the July heat, the kind of coat a man wore out of habit rather than weather. He had a hat pulled low, dark brown, the brim shaped by years of use into something that wasn't quite a proper curve anymore. He sat the horse the way some men sat, not performing it, just doing it the way breathing was done. Easy and unself-conscious. He slowed as he came alongside the station. Evelyn looked back down at her coin. She heard him dismount. Heard the reins looped over the hitching post. Heard his boots on the platform boards, a deliberate, unhurried sound that was somehow different from the way other men's boots sounded. Other men's boots announced them. His just carried him. She didn't look up. She heard him speak to Pruitt through the station door, something low that she couldn't make out, and Pruitt's response, "Over there, 3 days now." The boots came closer. She kept her eyes on her hands. They stopped in front of her. She waited for the question everyone asked. Are you waiting for someone, or the polite dismissal? Is there somewhere I can direct you, miss? Or the worst version, the one Pruitt's wife had offered on the second afternoon with her head tilted and her voice dipped in sympathy like a dipper in a rain barrel. Honey, sometimes men change their minds. Instead, the man in front of her said nothing for a long moment. Then, how long have you been sitting here? His voice was quiet. Not soft, the way some men went soft when they were being careful with a woman they thought might break. There was nothing careful about it. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that had room in it. Evelyn looked up. He was looking at her directly. Not at the bench, not at her trunk, at her face. Dark eyes under the brim of that hat, serious and still, and he wasn't flinching the way the townsfolk flinched when they saw how worn she'd gone. 3 days, she said. He nodded once slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Person you were waiting for didn't come. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it like one. No, she said. He didn't. He looked down the empty tracks for a moment. She watched him do it. Watched him look at the place where the train disappeared into the flat distance, as if he was considering something. Then he looked back at her. Then stop waiting for someone who chose not to come. Evelyn felt the words move through her like cold water. Not cruel, not pitying, just plain and true in a way that nobody had offered her in 3 days, and the plainness of it was almost worse than the cruelty would have been, because cruelty she could harden against. Truth just sat there. That's easier said, she told him. Most true things are. He pulled his hat off, not a grand gesture, just a habit, and held it in front of him. Dark hair damp at the temples from the heat. Lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into too many summers. Name's James Walker. I've got a ranch north of here, half a day's ride. I'm heading back this afternoon. She stared at him. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. You don't. You're offering a stranger a ride. I'm offering a woman who sat on a bench for 3 days in July, heat away off that bench. He looked at her trunk. That all you've got? That's all I've got. He nodded again, that same slow movement, like he was settling something internally. My ranch hand's wife cooks Tuesday nights. It's Tuesday. You'd eat. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She was not naive. She had not traveled from Virginia to Montana Territory and sat 3 days in the sun to become naive. She understood what the world did to women who accepted rides from strangers, understood the calculation. The town was probably already making about her, understood that getting on a horse behind a man she didn't know could go any number of directions, most of them bad. She also had one dime a trunk she couldn't carry and nowhere to go. "Why?" she asked. James Walker looked at her steadily. "Nobody ought to be left sitting on a bench until they disappear." It was not a romantic answer. It was not a heroic answer. It was the answer of a man who'd looked at a situation and found it unacceptable in the plainest possible terms, and that plainness was what decided her. Not hope, not desperation, but the simple human dignity of being found unacceptable by someone. She stood up. Her legs were stiff from the bench. She straightened them carefully, and she saw him notice and deliberately not react, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "I'm Evelyn Harper," she said. "I was a schoolteacher in Virginia." "James Walker," he said again. "I was a lot of things. Now I run cattle." He moved toward her trunk. "May I?" She stepped aside. He lifted the trunk like it weighed nothing, which it didn't. She hadn't packed as much as she'd thought she had. Looking back, and carried it to the horse, securing it with a practiced efficiency that told her he'd loaded and unloaded things from horses for a very long time. Pruitt came out onto the platform as they were preparing to leave. He looked at James, then at Evelyn, then back at James, with an expression that was half relief and half something else Evelyn didn't want to examine too carefully. "She's your concern now, Walker," Pruitt said. James didn't look at him. He was adjusting the strap on the trunk. "She's her own concern, Pruitt. Always was." Pruitt opened his mouth, closed it, and went back inside. Evelyn stood beside the horse and looked down at her hands. The mark from the coin had already faded. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right." "I don't know this country. I don't know how to ride particularly well. I don't have any money to speak of. I don't have family who know where I am." She looked up at him. "I'm telling you that because I think you should know what you're taking on whatever this is." James Walker looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and something moved through his expression. Not pity, she was certain of that, and not calculation either. Something older than both of those. "I know what I'm taking on," he said quietly. "Get up. I'll ride slow." The road north out of Caldwell Creek was dry and white with summer dust, and the heat pressed down on the flat land around them with the full authority of a Montana July afternoon. James rode in front for the first mile, leading the horse at the pace he'd promised, and Evelyn sat behind him with her hands braced on her own knees, refusing to hold on to him, because holding on to him seemed like a thing she wasn't ready to do yet. After a while he said without turning, "You can hold on. It's a long road." "I'm fine." "Suit yourself." After another mile, she put her hands on his sides just lightly, and he didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. The country opened up as they rode north, the scrub and the flat, giving way by degrees to something bigger. Grass that moved in the wind, in long, slow waves. Hills in the distance that hadn't been visible from the station. The sky coming down so far and wide on all sides that Evelyn felt for the first time in weeks like she could breathe to the bottom of her lungs. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. 8 years. "Where were you before?" A pause. "Different places." She understood from the pause that this was the edge of something, and she didn't push past it. "Do you have workers?" she asked instead. "2. Hector and his wife Clara. Hector runs the cattle with me. Clara keeps the house." Another pause, this one shorter. "The house needs keeping. I'm not much for it." "What does that mean?" "Means there's dishes in places they shouldn't be, and windows that haven't been opened since February." She almost smiled. It felt strange in the muscles of her face, like a movement she'd forgotten how to make properly. "That's honest." "I try to be." They rode through a shallow creek, crossing the water cold against the horse's legs, and Evelyn felt the spray on her ankles through her boots and thought she might have cried if she weren't so deliberately not crying. "What was his name?" James asked. "The man who didn't come." She considered not answering. "Thomas Reed." Know him? No, not personally. We corresponded. She said it flatly because there was no other way to say it that didn't make her feel stupid. For 8 months. James was quiet for a moment. 8 months is a long time. It felt longer. She looked at the grass moving around them. He wrote very well. Long letters, detailed. He described the land, the seasons. He described what he wanted. She stopped. I believed him. Not your fault. I know it isn't. She said it quickly because she did know in her head she knew it completely. It was something else entirely, the knowing and the feeling it, and she was not going to explain that to a man she'd met an hour ago on a bench. I simply wanted to say it out loud to someone who wasn't about to tell me that I should have known better. I wasn't going to say that. People usually do. I'm not people usually. He said it matter-of-factly without pride, and somehow that made it land as true in a way that a boast never could have. The ranch came into view an hour later. Low wooden buildings against the wide sky. A barn, a main house that was bigger than she'd expected but plainly made no adornments, just solid construction that had been built to last rather than to impress. A fenced area beyond held cattle, more than she could count from the road. A kitchen garden ran along the south side of the house, and she could see it had been planted with knowledge, but not recently tended. The rows were there. The intention was there, but the weeds had been having their own ideas for several weeks at least. Hector came out of the barn when he heard the horse. He was a compact man, brown from the sun, with a face that didn't give away much. He looked at Evelyn with no particular surprise, which surprised her. Found someone at the station, James said, handing Hector the reins. Clara's making stew, Hector said. There's enough. There's always enough, James said, and the way he said it told Evelyn that this was an old conversation, a comfortable one, and she felt the ache of being outside of something comfortable. Clara came to the door of the house while James was lifting Evelyn's trunk from the horse. She was a small woman, dark-haired with flour on her apron, and eyes that took Evelyn in from head to toe in about 3 seconds, without making it feel like being examined. You must be hungry, Clara said. Evelyn opened her mouth to say she was fine. What came out was, I haven't eaten properly since Sunday. Clara nodded like this was information she needed and had now received. Come in then. The stew's not ready, but I can do biscuits in 10 minutes. James put her trunk in the back room. James, already heading inside with the trunk, said nothing, which apparently was how he indicated agreement. Evelyn stood in the dooryard for a moment, looking at the house. The light was going long and gold in the late afternoon, the kind of light that made the plainest things look like something. The kitchen garden, weedy and struggling. The barn, needing paint. The fence posts along the east side, one of them leaning. She thought I could fix that fence. Then she thought, don't. Then she thought, I have 1 dime and nowhere to go. Then she went inside. The kitchen was warm, and it smelled like onions, and like something that had been simmering for a long time, and like the particular smell of a wood stove in a house where the stove was used seriously and not for show. Evelyn sat in this chair. Clara pointed her to, and watched Clara move around the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had cooked in this room for years and knew exactly where everything was without looking. Where are you from? Clara asked. Virginia. Long way. Not a judgment, just geography. Coming to meet someone. He didn't come. Clara made a sound that wasn't quite a word, but conveyed a complete and unambiguous opinion of men who didn't come. She slid a plate of biscuits onto the table and a jar of something dark and rich-smelling beside it. Eat, she said. The stew will be a while. Evelyn picked up a biscuit, and her hands were shaking slightly, and she made them stop. James came in from the back of the house and sat at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee he'd poured himself without asking, as if he'd done it 10,000 times in this chair at this table, which he probably had. He didn't watch her eat, which she appreciated. He looked out the window and drank his coffee and let her eat in peace. There's work here, he said after a while, not looking at her, just stating. Evelyn looked up. I'm not offering charity, he said. I'm saying the fact is, there's work. Clara does more than one person ought to. The garden's gone to pieces. The east fence needs attention. He looked at his coffee cup. I'm not much of a hand at knowing what needs doing around a house. Only what needs doing around cattle. You're saying you need help, Evelyn said. I'm saying there's work, he said again. If you're looking for a direction, there's one. If you're not, that's your business. Evelyn looked at the biscuit in her hands. She thought about the school in Virginia, the widow's room, the 31 students who now had a different teacher. She thought about Thomas Reed, who had written, "I need you," in a letter, and then simply hadn't come. And she thought about the way that kind of lie, the quiet lie, the hopeful lie, did something to a person that took a long time to undo. She thought about the fence post leaning east and the garden with weeds up past the carrots and the windows that hadn't been opened since February. "I'll stay," she said, "for a time." James Walker nodded once, the way he nodded at everything. Like her answer was the reasonable conclusion to a reasonable set of facts, and he had simply been waiting for her to arrive at it herself. "Room in the back's yours," he said. "Locks on the inside." She looked at him. "I'm telling you," he said quietly, "because I want you to know you don't have to wonder about it." Evelyn Harper set the biscuit down on the plate and looked at this man she had known for 4 hours. This man who had picked her up off a bench and brought her to a table and told her plainly, without sentiment, that she was safe under his roof. She didn't know what to do with that. She hadn't expected to have to figure out what to do with kindness offered without conditions. She had been bracing for conditions. "Thank you," she said. She said it like she meant it precisely and completely, because she did. James Walker drained his coffee and stood. "I've got evening chores," he said. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "Clara'll show you the room when you're done." He went out. Evelyn listened to his boots on the steps, then on the dry ground beyond, then nothing. Clara set a bowl of stew in front of her and sat across the table with her own, and they ate without speaking for a while, which was comfortable in a way that Evelyn hadn't expected it to be. "He's not what people say about him in town," Clara said after a while. Evelyn looked up. "What do they say?" "That he keeps to himself because he's cold, that he's strange." Clara tilted her head slightly. "He keeps to himself because he's been hurt, and he decided the way to not be hurt again was to not need anything from anybody." She paused. "He needs things. He just won't say it." "Why are you telling me this?" Clara picked up her coffee. "Because you're going to be here a while, and I'd rather you knew him right from the start than made up a story about him in your head that isn't true." Evelyn considered that. "How do you know I'll be here a while?" Clara smiled, small and certain. "Because he drove to that station to pick up supplies, and he came back with you instead. James Walker doesn't do things that don't matter." She stood and began clearing. "He saw something worth keeping. He usually sees right." Evelyn sat with that for a long moment after Clara left the kitchen. Outside, the last of the summer light was going down behind the hills, and the ranch was going quiet the way working land went quiet in the evening. Not empty, just still, everything settled in for the night in its proper place. She was in someone else's proper place. She was a woman with a dime in her pocket and a trunk of a life that had been going somewhere and wasn't anymore. She was a stranger at a table in a kitchen that smelled like onions and wood smoke, and something she couldn't name, but that registered in her chest as something like safety, which was perhaps the thing she was most frightened to trust. She picked up the last biscuit and ate it slowly. Tomorrow she would look at the garden. She would see what could still be saved this late in the summer. She would figure out the fence. She would not think about Thomas Reed. She would not think about Virginia. She would not wonder what James Walker saw when he looked at her, or whether Clara was right about him seeing right. She would simply be here in this kitchen with the lamp burning low and the sound of cattle settling for the night somewhere beyond the window, and she would let that be enough. It was, she thought. For tonight, it was enough. The morning after she arrived, Evelyn woke before the sun. She lay still for a moment in the narrow bed in the back room, listening to the ranch come alive around her. The low sounds of cattle shifting a door, closing somewhere in the house, the particular silence of a place where people rose early without being called to it. The room was plain. A bed, a washstand, a chair with a peg on the wall above it. The lock on the inside of the door was exactly where James Walker had said it would be. She had used it, not because she'd feared anything in the night. simply because he'd told her it was there, and she'd found she needed to test whether she could trust a thing he said before she could trust anything else about being here. The lock had been exactly where he said. She got up. Clara was already in the kitchen when Evelyn came out, moving between the stove and the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who had performed this particular sequence of tasks so many thousands of times it had become something close to music. She looked at Evelyn once, noted the dress she'd changed into the brown one, the practical one, not the ruined blue, and nodded as if Evelyn had passed some private assessment. "Coffee's there," Clara said. "Biscuits in 10 minutes. Can I help?" Clara paused in her movement. She turned and looked at Evelyn with a measuring expression that was not unkind. "You know how to bake. I know how to do most things in a kitchen. I kept house for my parents before they died." Clara tilted her head toward the flour sack. "Then do the biscuits. I'll do the eggs." They worked side by side without talking for several minutes, and Evelyn felt something in her shoulders, something she hadn't realized she was carrying release slightly. There was a comfort to useful hands. To knowing what came next, because you were making what came next. She'd forgotten that in 3 days of sitting still. When the biscuits were in the oven, she said without planning to, "Where does James eat?" "Out here, same as everyone. He doesn't stand on ceremony." Clara cracked an egg against the pan with a practiced flick. "You'll find he doesn't stand on much of anything, actually. Hector says it used to bother him. Now he thinks it's just how James is made." Clara. Evelyn hesitated. "What happened to him? You said last night he'd been hurt." Clara was quiet for a moment, tending the eggs. Then she said, "That's his story to tell or not tell. I'll just say it wasn't one thing. It was a series of things that a person oughtn't to have to go through before they're 30. She slid the eggs onto a plate. "He came out here and built this place, and that was how he decided to survive it. Some people talk their way through hard times. James builds things." The door opened before Evelyn could respond, and James Walker came in from outside, hat already on the sleeves of his shirt, already rolled to the elbow, despite the early hour. He looked at Evelyn at the counter with a brief, neutral expression that told her absolutely nothing about what he was thinking. "You made biscuits," he said. "Clara showed me where things were." He moved to the coffee without further comment and poured himself a cup and sat at the end of the table. Evelyn brought the biscuits out of the oven and set them on the table and sat across from Clara and the four of them. James and Clara and Evelyn and Hector, who appeared from outside just as the food was set, ate breakfast together in the easy silence of people who had shared a table enough times to not need words to fill it. Except Evelyn hadn't shared this table before, and the ease of it startled her. "Halfway through breakfast," James said without looking up from his plate. "The East Garden's yours if you want it." Evelyn set down her coffee. "I noticed the weeds yesterday." "I noticed them in April," he said. "Didn't do anything about them." "Is that your way of apologizing?" He looked up at that. Just briefly, and something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was the shape that came just before one. "Might be," he said. Then he looked back at his plate. Hector across the table caught Evelyn's eye and said nothing, but communicated clearly that this was in Hector's experience an extraordinary degree of warmth from James Walker before 7 in the morning. She went to the garden after breakfast. It was worse than it had looked from the road. The weeds had taken over the carrot rows entirely, and something had gotten into the bean patch rabbits, she guessed from the evidence, and the tomato plants were leaning badly from lack of staking. But the soil was good. She could feel it when she knelt and worked her fingers in. Good, dark, cared-for soil that had been built up over years by someone who knew what they were doing. "He planted it himself," Clara said from behind her. Evelyn turned. Clara had followed her out, wiping her hands on her apron. 4 years ago. The first 2 years it was beautiful. Then things got busy with the cattle, and he stopped keeping up with it, and I don't have the time, and Hector won't go near a vegetable on principle." Evelyn looked at the neglected rows. 4 years, she said. "And he kept the soil. Like I said, he builds things." Clara squinted at the tomatoes. "You think there's anything worth saving?" "Most of it." Evelyn stood and brushed off her knees. "The carrots might be a loss, But the tomatoes, the beans, if we stake them and clear the weeds and water properly for the next few weeks, there'll be a harvest." She paused. "Late, but there." Clara looked at her in a way that was assessing and warm at the same time. "He'll notice," she said. "James always notices even when he doesn't say so. I'm not doing it so he'll notice." "I know," Clara said. "That's exactly why he will." Evelyn worked through the morning. She pulled weeds until her back ached, and her hands were dark with soil, and she staked the tomato plants with strips of old cloth she found in the barn, and she cleared the bean patch and replanted what the rabbits had missed. And she lost herself in the work, in the specific way that work with hands and soil allowed, not thinking, just doing, the mind going quiet while the body was occupied. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear James approach until he was standing 3 feet away. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was looking at what she'd done, at the cleared rows, the staked tomatoes, the order that was beginning to emerge from the chaos of a neglected garden. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "You know what you're doing." "My mother kept a garden. I helped her from the time I could walk." He crouched down beside her and looked at the tomato plants she'd staked. He reached out and checked the knot on one of the cloth strips, not doubting her work. She realized just the habitual check of a man who verified things. The knot was good. He let it go. "The carrots are gone," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't be. They were gone before you got here." He looked at her sideways. "You've been out here since 8. It's past noon." Evelyn blinked and looked at the sky. He was right. The sun had moved considerably further than she'd registered. "I lost track," she said. "There's water in the house." He stood. "And Clara made lunch." She stood too slower. Her back had opinions about the morning, and he watched her straighten without comment, but also without looking away, and she had the unsettling sense of being seen clearly, which was different from being watched. "James," she said. He stopped. "Why did you come to the station yesterday? The real reason." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he looked not at her, but at the garden, at what she'd done to it. Pruitt sent word that there was a woman been sitting on his bench 3 days, and he didn't know what to do about her. He thought somebody oughta. He paused. "I was the somebody who was willing." "Just that. I've been left places before," he said, quietly, simply, with no invitation to follow the statement further. "I know how it looks on a person." Evelyn opened her mouth and closed it again. He turned and walked back toward the house, and she watched him go, and she thought that Clara was right about something. He didn't need many words, because the few he used were doing the work of many. She followed him in for lunch. The days that followed made a shape that Evelyn hadn't expected. Not the shape of temporary or of transition, but of something settling. She woke early. She made biscuits or cornbread while Clara did the eggs. She worked the garden through the mornings. In the afternoons, she helped Clara with the heavier housework, the kind that had built up in a place where one person was doing the work of 2, and she found that she and Clara fell into the rhythm of it, naturally talking sometimes and not talking other times with equal comfort. James was in and out. The ranch ran on cattle, and cattle kept their own schedule, and his days were long and physically demanding in a way that left its mark on him by evening. Not complaint. He never complained. Just the particular quiet of a man who has used himself up honestly for the day. He ate dinner. He drank coffee occasionally. He sat on the porch while the light faded. Twice she passed him there, and he looked up, and she said good night, and he said it back, and she went inside, and neither of them made more of it than it was. On the 5th day, she found the chair. It was in the corner of the main room, a wooden chair with a broken back leg leaning against the wall, as if someone had put it there, intending to fix it, and then found other things to do for several months. She looked at it for a moment, then went to find Hector. "Does he have a saw?" she asked. "And nails, and a piece of wood for a dowel." Hector took her to the barn and showed her where the tools were kept with the careful organization of a man who took tools seriously, and she found what she needed, and she fixed the chair that afternoon. She'd learned from her father, who had fixed everything in their house himself, and insisted she learn beside him, because he'd said a woman who could fix things never had to wait for someone else to fix things for her. She brought the chair back inside and put it where it had been. That evening at dinner, James sat in the chair automatically and then stopped. He pressed his hand to his back leg, then stood and looked at the repair. He looked at Evelyn across the table. "That was you," he said. "It was leaning. It bothered me." He looked at the chair again. He sat back down in it, tested it. It was solid, she'd done it right. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "My father. He fixed everything." James was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good man." "The best I knew," Evelyn said, "until the fever." He nodded, and he didn't say he was sorry in the empty way. People said they were sorry, and she appreciated that too. After dinner, while Clara washed up and Hector went to check the cattle, James stayed at the table with his coffee, and Evelyn stayed with hers, and for the first time it was just the two of them in the kitchen, and the quiet between them was different from the dinner quiet, smaller, more specific. "You never asked me," she said. He looked at her. "Everyone asks. Why a letter? Why a man I'd never met? Why I'd travel that far on a letter?" She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "You haven't asked." "It's your business," he said. "You're not curious." He considered the question as if it deserved consideration. "I think people have reasons for the choices they make, and usually the reasons make sense if you know everything behind them. I don't know everything behind you." He looked at his coffee. "So I figured judging the choice doesn't help anybody." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "His letters were kind," she said. Not because he'd asked. Because she wanted to say it to someone who wasn't going to use it to confirm a poor opinion of her. He wrote about wanting a real life. A partner. Not a woman to manage his house, but someone to build something with. I believed that. I was 30, had been teaching long enough to know that what I wanted wasn't just a classroom forever. I wanted... She stopped. "What did you want?" he asked. And the way he asked it was the way he did most things, direct and quiet with no pressure behind it. "I wanted to matter to someone," she said. "Specifically. Not generally the way teachers matter to students, which is real, but also replaceable. I wanted to matter to one person who'd chosen me the way you choose something important." She looked at the table. Thomas Reed's letters said all of that. He was a good writer. "And a poor man," James said quietly. "Yes." She looked up. "Yes, that exactly." He drank his coffee and said nothing more, but something in the air of the kitchen had shifted slightly. The way a room shifted when a window opened and air moved through it for the first time in a long while. She went to bed that night thinking about what Clara had said. He builds things. She thought she was beginning to understand what that meant. It was on the 8th day that she found out James Walker was carrying something he hadn't told her. She came into the barn to return a tool she'd borrowed, and she heard his voice before she saw him, low and strained, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Nothing like the measured quiet she'd come to know. He was speaking to Hector, and she stopped just inside the door because the tone of it held her still. "I'm telling you, it's not a concern," James was saying. "I'm telling you it is," Hector said, and his voice had an edge too, the edge of a man who'd been holding this argument for longer than today. "Donovan doesn't send a rider all the way out here to ask politely, James. He sends a rider when he's decided something. And what he's decided is that your north pasture is going to become his north pasture one way or another." A silence. "That pasture belonged to my family," James said. "My grandfather homesteaded that land. I've got paper on every inch of it." "Paper doesn't stop a man like Donovan. Paper just makes the lawyers rich." Hector's voice dropped. "He bought the deed on the Cartwright place last spring. He's bought 3 others since. He's building something, James, and your land is in the middle of it." Another silence longer. "I know," James said, and the 2 words came out flat and weighted, like a man who has been knowing something difficult for a while and is finally saying it out loud. Evelyn backed out of the barn quietly. She stood outside with the tool in her hands and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She went back to the garden and worked until her hands stopped being unsteady. At dinner that night, James was quieter than usual. Not the comfortable quiet, but the closed kind, the kind that came from inside something heavy. He ate without conversation, and when he was done, he excused himself earlier than usual and went out to the porch. Evelyn helped Clara clear the table, and then after a moment's consideration, she poured a second cup of coffee and took it outside. Howe was sitting in this porch chair. The one whose back she'd noticed also needed attention. She registered automatically, and he looked up when she came out. She held out the coffee. He took it. He didn't ask why she'd brought it, and she didn't explain. She sat on the porch steps facing out rather than toward him, giving them both the privacy of not looking directly at the other. After a while she said, "You don't have to tell me anything." "I know. But if you want to talk, I'm not going anywhere tonight." He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she thought he'd decided not to. Then he said, "You know a man named Donovan Silas Donovan?" "I don't know anyone here." "No." He exhaled. "He owns most of the land south of Caldwell Creek. Bought it up piece by piece over the last 4 years. He's got money, and he's got lawyers, and he's got the kind of patience that comes from knowing you're going to win eventually, so you can afford to wait." He drank the coffee. "He wants my north pasture." "And you don't want to sell?" "It's not about wanting. My grandfather built this ranch on that pasture. My father ran his first cattle there. I buried them both on that land." His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath the level, something deep and old, and not in any way abstract. "It's not land I can sell. It's not a thing I can do." Evelyn turned to look at him then. He was looking out at the dark, at the shape of the land against the last of the light. "What is Donovan doing?" she asked. "Building a monopoly," James said. "When one man owns all the land and all the water rights and all the access, everyone else is working for him, whether they agreed to or not." He paused. "I've got 3 neighbors who already sold. Didn't want to, but he made it hard enough for them to stay, that leaving felt like the better option." His jaw tightened. "He does that. He doesn't come at you directly. He just makes things difficult until you tire out." "And you won't tire out." He looked at her. "Not on this." She believed him. She had known him 9 days, but she believed him about this completely, and the certainty of that belief surprised her with how firm it was. "Is that why you live out here alone?" she asked. "Has it been this way long?" He turned back to the dark. "Long enough." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He set the coffee cup on the rail. "I had a partner years ago, man named Collins. We were going to run this place together, build it up. He sold his share to Donovan when the pressure started without telling me first. Just sold it and left." He said it plainly without drama, but she heard what it cost him to say plainly. "Donovan didn't get what he wanted because my half wasn't Collins's to sell. But I spent 2 years in court over it, and I won, and it cost me most of what I had saved." He was quiet a moment. "After that, I stopped going into business with people. Easier." "Easier isn't always better," Evelyn said. "No," he said, "but it's easier." She wanted to press further. She didn't. She was learning the geography of him, where the edges were, where the ground was firm enough to stand on, where it dropped away. The Collins story was an edge. She'd gotten it because he'd offered it, not because she'd pushed, and she understood that the distinction mattered to him, even if he'd never said so. "Donovan will send someone again," she said. "When he does, you should have someone write it all down. What was said, who said it, the date." She paused. "Evidence matters. Teachers know that you can't discipline a child fairly if you haven't kept records." He looked at her sideways. "You're comparing Silas Donovan to a difficult child. I'm comparing the principle. Documentation is protection." She stood and picked up her cup. "My father used to say that a man who keeps good records is a man who can prove his truth." James Walker was quiet for a moment. Then slowly he said, "Your father was a smart man." "He was," she said. "Good night, James." "Good night, Evelyn." She went inside. Clara was still in the kitchen rolling dough for morning, and she looked at Evelyn with a question in her eyes that she didn't ask out loud, and Evelyn answered the unasked question by sitting down at the table and pouring herself a small glass of water and saying nothing particular. Clara nodded and kept rolling dough. The next morning, James came to the garden. I didn't come to look at it or to check on her. He came in work clothes with his sleeves rolled, and he crouched beside the east row and started pulling weeds without asking whether she wanted help or whether she had a system. She almost told him she had a system. Then she looked at him crouched in the dirt, pulling weeds with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. And she said nothing, just moved to the next row and worked beside him. They worked through the better part of the morning without talking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of work that didn't need commentary, just two people doing a thing that needed doing together. At one point, she asked him without looking up. "Do you know why the beans on the north end didn't come in?" "Drainage is poor on that corner," he said. "Water sits." "Can it be fixed?" "Probably. Depends how much work you want to put into it." She considered. "It'd be worth it next season." He went still for just a moment. Just briefly, the kind of stillness that happens when something lands on a person that they hadn't expected. Then he went back to pulling weeds and said, "Then we'll fix it, before the first freeze. Next season." She'd said next season as if it were obvious, and he'd accepted it as if it were obvious, and neither of them commented on the fact that neither of them had actually said anything about her staying past the immediate arrangement. Evelyn kept her face turned to the garden so he wouldn't see the small, complicated expression on it. An hour later, Hector rode in fast from the north pasture, too fast. The wrong kind of speed for a routine afternoon, and James stood immediately when he heard it standing before Hector had even cleared the fence. "Rider on the north boundary," Hector said, pulling his horse up short. "Left something behind. Postmarker, says Donovan Land Holdings on it." James's face went very still. Evelyn had seen that stillness before twice in the last 9 days, and she'd learned to read it. It wasn't calm. It was the particular stillness of a man holding something in very tight. "Where?" he said. "Corner of the north pasture, by the creek." "That creek is on my land," James said. 12 feet from the property line on my side." "I know it is," Hector said. James turned to go get his horse. "James," Evelyn said. He stopped. She came toward him and said low, so only he could hear, "Don't go out there angry. Whatever he put on that post, the only thing that matters is what's on your deed. Have you got it?" He looked at her. "It's in the house." "Then get it out tonight and check every word of it. Know your boundaries the way you know your own name." She held his gaze. "Go look at what Donovan put there if you need to. But come back and read your deed. That's how you fight this kind of man." Something moved through his expression. Not relief, not quite, but the recognition of a person who'd been carrying something alone, encountering someone who understood the shape of what they were carrying. "All right," he said quietly. He rode out with Hector. She watched him go, and then turned and went inside and found Clara in the kitchen. "Where does he keep his papers?" she asked. "The land documents." Clara pointed to the cabinet in the main room without asking why. Evelyn found the deed in the second drawer folded into an oilskin pouch, and she sat at the table and read every word of it carefully twice, matching the boundary descriptions against what she knew of the land from her 3 weeks on it. Everything James had said was right. The creek was clearly within his property line. There was nothing ambiguous about it. She folded the deed back carefully. She was sitting at the table when James came in 2 hours later with the postmarker in his hand. He set it on the table. The words were stamped into the wood fresh and dark, Donovan Land Holdings. Surveyed Aug. 1884. She looked at it then, at the deed she'd laid out on the table, boundary descriptions visible. He looked at the deed. He looked at her. "You read it," he said. "I wanted to be sure," she said. "I didn't think you'd mind, but if you do, I apologize." He shook his head slowly. He sat down and read the deed himself, then looked at the postmarker. "This is a lie," he said, quietly, flatly. "It's a provocation," she said. "He put it there to make you angry and to make you react before you've thought it through. The question isn't the marker. The question is whether he's filed anything with the county office to back it up." She paused. "Has he?" James looked up. "I don't know." "Then that's where we start," Evelyn said. "I can write a letter to the county recorder's office, formally, requesting confirmation of your deed boundaries and whether any competing claim has been filed." She straightened the deed. "A teacher writes a great many official letters. I know how to make them count." He stared at her. Not with surprise. "Exactly. There was something different in the look, something she hadn't seen from him before, like a door opening slightly in a face that was usually closed. It was only a moment. Then he looked back at the documents. "You'd do that," he said, not a question. More like he was saying it to settle the fact of it into something he could hold on to. "You let me sleep under your roof and eat at your table," Evelyn said. "And you didn't ask me to be something I wasn't in exchange for it." She met his eyes when he looked up. "James, that's not nothing. That's not a small thing. So yes, I'd do that." He was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "Write the letter." She wrote it that evening at the kitchen table with Clara making tea on the stove and the lamp burning steady, and she was meticulous about it. The language precise and formal and utterly clear about what was being asked and on whose behalf and under what legal basis. When she was done, she read it to James, and he listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You didn't leave any room for misunderstanding." That was the point. He looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he said, "Evelyn." "Yes." "I want you to know something." He looked up at her, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who doesn't say things easily, saying something he's decided needs to be said. "What you're doing here, the garden, the chair, the letter. I don't take it for granted." She held his gaze. "I know you don't. I want to make sure you know I know it." He paused. "Some things people do for other people, they don't get told it's noticed. It ought to be said." The kitchen was quiet. The lamp burned. Outside somewhere on the north pasture, there was a postmarker that didn't belong there, and a man who'd planted it who thought one isolated rancher could be worn down into surrender. He didn't know this rancher had someone writing his letters now, and he didn't know, could not have known, standing out on that land with his crew and his lawyers and his surveying equipment, that the woman sitting at that kitchen table with a pen in her hand had traveled hundreds of miles on the strength of a lie and had arrived somewhere real by accident and was becoming slowly and without ceremony the most dangerous thing a liar could face. Someone who kept records, someone who knew what she was worth, and someone who was beginning against every reasonable expectation she'd brought west with her to know what this place was worth too. She sealed the letter. "I'll take it to town in the morning," James said. "First light," she agreed. He stood, picked up the letter, and looked at her one more time with that same almost open expression, the one she was learning to recognize as the closest thing he had to saying something large. Then he said goodnight and went to bed. Evelyn sat at the table a moment longer. She thought about Thomas Reed, who had written beautiful letters about wanting a real life, a real partner, someone to build something with. She thought about James Walker, who said almost nothing and built things with his hands instead. She blew out the lamp. The letter came back from the county recorder's office 11 days after James rode it into town. Evelyn was in the garden when she heard the horse on the road, and she stood and shaded her eyes and watched James come through the gate with a folded document in his hand. She could tell from the way he was riding, not fast, not slow, but deliberate, the way a man rode when he was thinking hard about something he'd just learned, that the news was not simple. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet him. He dismounted and handed her the document without preamble. She unfolded it and read it standing there in the yard, and when she was done, she read it again and her stomach went cold. "He filed," she said, 6 weeks ago. James's voice was flat. "Before the marker, before the writer. He filed a competing claim on 12 acres of my north pasture 6 weeks ago, and nobody sent me notice. They were supposed to send notice. They were." He took the document back and looked at it with the expression of a man staring at something that has already done its damage. "The recorder says notice was sent to the address on file. The address on file is wrong. It's an address from 8 years ago, before I built the house." Evelyn went very still. "That's not an accident." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. "Someone changed your address in the county records." He nodded once. "Or Donovan has someone in that office who makes sure certain addresses stay wrong." The weight of it settled between them. This was not a man planting a postmarker to provoke. This was a man who had been quietly building a legal trap for months, and the trap was already closed, and James Walker was standing in the middle of it. "How long do you have to contest it?" she asked. 30 days from notice. They're saying notice was given 6 weeks ago. He paused. Which means I have no time, legally. According to what they've filed, my window to contest is already gone. Evelyn took the document back. She read it a third time slower. Her hands were steady. Everything in her that felt afraid or angry, she pushed to the back, and she read the document like a teacher reading a student's work, looking for what was wrong, looking for what was missing, looking for the error. She found it. James. She pointed to a line in the third paragraph. The notice requirement. Look at the statute citation. They've cited Section 41 of the Land Records Act. He leaned in and looked. Section 41 applies to commercial land transfers, she said, not to homestead claims. For homestead claims, the statute is Section 57, and Section 57 requires notice to be delivered in person or by registered post to the claimant's current address, verified within 90 days of filing. She looked up at him. Has anyone come to this property in the last 6 weeks to verify your current address? He stared at her. No. Then they haven't complied with the correct statute. The notice is invalid. Your contest window hasn't started. She held the document out. This is their mistake, or they assumed you wouldn't know enough to find it. James Walker took the paper from her hands and read the lines she'd indicated, and she watched something shift in his face. Not relief, not yet, but the first loosening of something that had been pulled wire tight. You're certain, he said. Get a lawyer to confirm it. But yes, I'm certain. She met his eyes. Donovan is smart, but he made assumptions about what you know and who's in your corner. She paused. He assumed you were alone. James looked at her for a long moment with that almost open expression, the one she'd seen twice before. Then he looked at the document. I'll ride to Caldwell Creek tomorrow, he said. There's a lawyer there, Pemberton. He's honest. Take the deed. Take this document, and take a written account of the marker that was placed on your land and the date it was placed. She paused. Everything documented, everything with a date. He folded the document carefully. You remember saying your father believed in records. I do. Smart man. He tucked the document into his coat, getting smarter by the day. It was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him. And it was so unexpected and so dry that she laughed a real laugh, short and surprised, and he looked at her face when she laughed with an expression she couldn't read because she wasn't used to it, like someone watching something come back to life. The next morning he rode to town and Evelyn worked the garden and tried not to watch the road. He came back in the late afternoon with Pemberton's assessment, written in the lawyer's hand, confirming everything Evelyn had identified, and with a plan that involved filing an immediate challenge to the notice process and a formal request for reinstatement of the contest period. Pemberton had also noted something else, something that had made James's jaw tighten on the ride home. He said Donovan's had this done before. James told her at dinner, his voice controlled. 2 other ranchers in the last 3 years. Both of them lost land. Both of them didn't know the right statute. Clara set down her ladle. He's done this twice already and nobody stopped him. One of them didn't have money for a lawyer. The other one got scared and sold before the case could finish. James looked at his plate. Donovan knows exactly what he's doing. He knows most people don't fight back because fighting back costs money and time that working ranchers don't have. But we have the error, Evelyn said. Pemberton thinks we can get the contest period reinstated. James agreed. He's less certain about winning the underlying claim. Donovan's survey is, it's professionally done. Whoever he hired, they know their work. He paused. Pemberton says our best argument is the original homestead filing. My grandfather's original survey from 1851. Evelyn looked up. Where is it? If it exists still, James said, it would be at the Federal Land Office in Helena. A silence. That's 3 days' ride, Hector said. I know. Evelyn said carefully. Could it be requested by post officially? If Pemberton filed the request as legal counsel, the federal office would have to respond. It would take time, James said. Yes, but it would be official. Donovan can't interfere with a federal records request. She looked at him steadily. He has money and he has lawyers, and he has someone in the county office who changes addresses. But he can't tamper with federal records requests without crossing a line that would end him. James looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Hector. Then he looked at the table. "All right," he said. "We do it that way." What followed were 3 weeks of a particular kind of tension, the kind that lived in the background of everything always present, never fully erupting. Evelyn went about the work of the ranch. The garden was coming in now properly, the tomatoes heavy on their stakes, the beans recovered and climbing. Clara had started putting up preserves. The east fence had been repaired. The windows had been opened since February. Every one of them. The house smelled like summer and like something lived in. But there was always the awareness of the north pasture. There was always the knowledge that Silas Donovan was out there patient and methodical with his lawyers and his money and his survey crew, waiting for James Walker to make a mistake or run out of fight. James didn't run out of fight. But Evelyn could see the cost of it in the way he ate dinner without really tasting it some evenings, in the way he sat on the porch later and longer, in the way he occasionally looked at the north toward the pasture with an expression that was not fear, but was something adjacent to it. The fear of losing what his grandfather built. The fear that being right and being careful and doing everything properly still might not be enough against a man with unlimited money and corrupt allies. She didn't try to fix that fear. She couldn't. But she started sitting on the porch steps in the evenings, more often the way she had the night he'd told her about Collins, and she let the company be what it was. Someone present, someone not going anywhere. He noticed. She could tell he noticed, and she could tell that her knowing he'd noticed sat comfortably with both of them in the way that things did when they'd been established slowly and honestly. It was on a Tuesday evening in early September, 3 weeks after Pemberton had filed the federal records request, that Thomas Reed rode up to the gate. Evelyn was on the porch. She saw the rider coming down the road and thought nothing of it. Riders came past, regularly. Ranching country was traveling country until the rider slowed at the gate, and she recognized the way he sat a horse. Something went cold in her chest before her mind had finished identifying why. She had never met Thomas Reed in person. But she had a photograph. Small, the kind men sent with letters to prove they were real. She had looked at it enough times in the months of correspondence that her body recognized him before her brain did, the way the body remembered things that the mind wanted to be wrong about. She stood. The rider came through the gate, and she was right. She was completely right. Thomas Reed was 38, broad-shouldered, with a pleasant face that she had once found reassuring in the photograph, and now found in person, arranged into an expression of practiced warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Evelyn," he said, pulling his horse up short. He said her name as if he had every right to it. "I've been looking for you." She said nothing. She stood very straight on the porch steps and said absolutely nothing, and let the silence do what silence did, which was expose things. "I owe you an explanation," he said. He swung down from the horse with the ease of a man who believed the gesture demonstrated good faith. "I was delayed. There were circumstances." "Thomas," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her and shouldn't have. "You weren't delayed. 6 weeks is a delay. 12 weeks is a choice." His expression shifted slightly. The practiced warmth adjusted, recalibrated. "You're angry. That's fair." He spread his hands. "But I'm here now. I've come to make this right." "There's nothing to make right," Evelyn said. "I've made other arrangements." His eyes went to the house, to the ranch around it, and something behind them sharpened into an assessment that was more honest than anything else he'd shown. "Arrangements," he repeated. "With Walker." "That's not your concern." "I'd argue it is." He came closer to the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her with an expression that was shifting from warmth to something that thought it was authority. "Evelyn, you came west on an agreement between us. That agreement is still—" "There was no agreement," she said flatly. "A letter is not a contract, and a man who doesn't appear is not a man honoring the terms of whatever he imagined he'd offered." She held his gaze. "Why are you here, Thomas, really?" Something moved through his face. It was fast, and it was not pleasant, and she saw it clearly, a flash of calculation, a reassessment. Then the warmth came back. "I told you. I came to buy Mr. Reed." James Walker's voice came from behind her, and she didn't turn to look at him, because she'd been so focused on Thomas Reed that she hadn't heard him come out of the house, which meant he'd heard the conversation through the open window or the door, and had come out with intent. He stepped up beside her on the porch, and he wasn't tall in the theatrical way that some men performed height, but he was present in a way that took up its own space, and Thomas Reed's eyes went to him, and then narrowed by a fraction. "Walker," Reed said. He said it like he knew the name, like he'd expected the name. "You've come a long way," James said, mildly. "From what I understand." "I came for Evelyn," Reed said. "That's my only business here." "Evelyn," James said without looking at her, "has told you she's made other arrangements. That seems to settle the matter." "With respect," Reed said, and the words had no respect in them at all. "What's between Evelyn and me isn't your business to settle." "She's on my land," James said, still mild, completely unmoved. "So I'll ask you to conclude your conversation and move along." Thomas Reed looked at James Walker for a long moment with an expression that was taking stock. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Can we speak privately?" he said. "Just for a moment. I came a long way, Evelyn." She looked at him. Part of her. The part that had spent 8 months reading his letters. The part that had sewn the blue dress and packed the trunk and said goodbye to everything she'd known, felt the old pull of it. The story she'd built around him. The life she'd imagined. That part of her wanted to hear whatever he was going to say, wanted to believe there was an explanation that made it make sense. She recognized that part. She understood it. And she set it aside. "No," she said. Reed's face went still. "Evelyn." "No," she said again. Clearly. Completely. "Goodbye, Tom." Something happened to his face, then the warmth dropping away all at once like a mask coming off too quickly. And what was underneath was not rage exactly, but something harder and colder and more deliberate. He looked at her with that face for just a moment. Then he looked at James. "This isn't finished," he said. "Ride on," James said quietly. Reed held his gaze for another moment. Then he mounted his horse, and he looked at Evelyn one more time with that cold, deliberate expression, and he turned and rode back out the gate. Evelyn stood very still until the sound of the horse faded down the road. Then her hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and made them stop, and she turned to go inside, and James said quietly, "Evelyn." She stopped. "You all right?" She thought about it honestly. "Not entirely," she said. "But I will be." He nodded, and she went inside, and she sat at the kitchen table, and Clara brought her a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, and sat across from her without saying anything, which was exactly right. After a while, Evelyn said, "He wasn't what he wrote." "Men rarely are," Clara said. "He knew your name," Evelyn said. "James's name. He said it like he'd expected to find him here." She frowned. "How would he know that he couldn't have known where I went after the station?" Clara set down her cup slowly. "Pruitt," she said, "at the station." Evelyn looked at her. "Pruitt knows everyone," Clara said. "And Pruitt talks. He'd have told Reed I went with James." If Reed asked, yes. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the tea. "He came here knowing it was James's ranch." She thought about Reed's face when he'd looked at James. The way he'd said the name, not surprised by it, not reacting to it as new information. "He wasn't only here for me." Clara said nothing, which was its own form of agreement. James came in an hour later and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Evelyn with a question he wasn't asking out loud. "He knew your name before you spoke," she said. "He wasn't surprised by you. He was expecting you." James came in and sat down. "That's what I thought." "What would Thomas Reed want with your ranch?" He looked at the table. "I've been thinking about that since he rode up." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Reed owns land south of Caldwell Creek, 300 acres, cattle, some crops. He's been there 8 years. He paused. "His land is bordered on the north by Donovan's acquisitions, and on the east by the creek access to my pasture." The pieces connected in Evelyn's mind with a cold, clean click. "If Donovan takes your north pasture," she said slowly, "Reed's eastern creek access goes with it." "Reed loses water rights," James said. Without that creek, his cattle operation can't survive the summer. So he needs you to lose your land. She looked at James steadily. And you marrying me or taking me in or whatever he imagined would have complicated your legal standing on the land somehow. If he could prove I'd lured you here under false pretenses, James said, or that I had some involvement in why you didn't find him at that station, which he could fabricate. Given that he's apparently a man who fabricates things, he could file a civil claim against me that would tie up my legal resources while Donovan completed the land claim. His jaw was tight. It's not a guaranteed strategy, but it would cost me time and money I don't have. Evelyn sat with that. "He used me," she said. It was not a question, and it did not come out broken, and she was proud of that. The letters, the proposal, getting me to come west, all of it was to put me in position to be a problem for you. "I think so," James said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did he know you'd be the one to pick me up from the station?" James shook his head slowly. "I don't think it mattered. He just needed a woman with a grievance against someone in the area. Whether it was me or someone else who took you in, he'd have found a way to use it." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry that you were part of someone else's plan without knowing it." "Don't apologize," she said. "It doesn't change where I am." She looked at her tea. "And where I am, I chose. After the station. I chose to get on that horse. That was mine." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression had the quality of something being decided, something quiet and internal that didn't announce itself but settled in the way the right thing settled when it was recognized. "Evelyn," he said, "Reed coming here changes things." "How?" "He knows what we've filed. He'll tell Donovan we have the original homestead argument, that we found the statute error that we're fighting." He looked at the table. "Donovan's been patient because he thought this would be easy. Now he knows it isn't. Patient men stop being patient when they find out they were wrong about the difficulty." Evelyn thought about that. "He'll escalate." "Yes." "How does a man like Donovan escalate?" James looked at her. "He makes things uncomfortable. Supply routes feed deliveries cattle buyers. He has relationships with most of the merchants in Caldwell Creek. He can make it so people don't want to do business with me." He paused. "He can make it so Pemberton doesn't want the case." Evelyn went still. Would he threaten a lawyer? He'd apply pressure, quietly, professionally. He wouldn't threaten directly, he's too careful for that. But he'd make it known that working against his interests was an uncomfortable place to be. James exhaled. "Pemberton has other clients in this county. He has a family. He's an honest man, but honest men have limits when the pressure gets personal." The kitchen was quiet. Clara had gone still by the stove listening, and Hector had come in at some point without Evelyn noticing, and all of them sat with the shape of what James had just described, the specific suffocating shape of a powerful man, making the ordinary world close in around a person until there was nowhere left to go. Evelyn said, "Then we need Pemberton to file everything critical before the pressure reaches him." James looked at her. All the key filings, the contest period reinstatement, the federal records request status, the formal documentation of the statute error. Everything that needs to be on record with the court. Put it on record before Donovan can get to Pemberton. She leaned forward slightly. "Once it's filed, it's filed. Donovan can make Pemberton uncomfortable, but he can't make court filings disappear." James stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "We'd need to ride in tomorrow." "Then we ride in tomorrow." Hector from the corner said very quietly, "I'll have the horses ready before light." Clara said nothing. She turned back to the stove and stirred something with more force than the stirring required, which was her own form of agreement. James looked at Evelyn across the table with the expression she'd come to recognize, the almost open one. The one that was the closest thing he had to saying something enormous, and she looked back at him steadily, and neither of them looked away. The morning was cold for September, the first real cold of the coming season, and they rode into Caldwell Creek as the sun was still climbing. James and Evelyn and Hector, with a folder of documents that Evelyn had organized the night before by filing order and marked in her careful schoolteacher's hand. Pemberton was in his office before 8. He was a thin man with glasses and careful eyes, and when James laid out the folder and explained what needed to be filed today, immediately. Pemberton read through the organization of the documents and looked at Evelyn over the tops of his glasses. "This is your work," he said. "I organized what James had gathered," she said. "You did more than organize." He set the folder down. "This is a complete filing strategy, in the correct sequence." He looked at James. "Where did you find her?" "Station bench," James said. Pemberton looked back at Evelyn. "Do you have legal training?" "I was a school teacher," she said. "But I've always believed that understanding what's written is the difference between being subject to a system and being able to use one." Pemberton took off his glasses and cleaned them, which she was beginning to understand was what he did when he was thinking hard about something. "I'll file today," he said. "All of it." He put his glasses back on. "I should tell you both that Silas Donovan came to see me yesterday afternoon." The room went quiet. "How was very cordial," Pemberton said. He said it with the precise neutrality of a man reporting facts whose implications spoke for themselves. He expressed his hope that as a member of this community, I understood the value of stable land ownership and of not prolonging disputes that were, in his view, already resolved. He looked at James. He also mentioned that he is aware of who has been helping you prepare your legal response. Evelyn felt it land in her chest, not fear, something cleaner and colder than fear. "He mentioned me." "Not by name," Pemberton said. "He said he was aware you had recently taken in a woman of uncertain background and unknown purpose. He suggested that her involvement in your affairs might create, and I'm quoting, complications for her that she was not in a position to handle." The silence that followed was complete. James's face had gone to the particular stillness. The one she knew now was anger held in tight, very tight, by a man who understood that expressing it directly would serve his enemy's purposes. "He's threatening her," James said. Quiet, flat. "He's implying," Pemberton said carefully. "He's a man who implies things." Evelyn put her hand on James's arm. She felt him tense, and then go still under her hand, and she looked at Pemberton. "File everything today," she said, "and bill me separately for any portion of this that relates to my involvement." Both men looked at her. "I'm not a charity case, and I'm not someone's leverage," she said. "I'm a party to this situation by my own choice, and I will pay my own way in it." She met Pemberton's eyes. "Can you file today?" "I'll have it done by noon," he said. "Good." She stood. "Then let's be done by noon." They waited in the lawyer's office while he drafted, and James sat beside her without speaking, and at one point, without ceremony, he put his hand over hers, where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them let go. At noon, Pemberton came out of his back office with a stack of filed documents stamped "Recorded Official" and laid them on the desk. "It's done," he said. "For what it's worth. Mr. Walker, I want you to know that a man implying things to me in my office does not change my professional obligations to my client." He looked at Evelyn. "And I want you to know, Miss Harper, that in my experience, the people Silas Donovan considers threatening are the people giving him the most trouble." He paused. "I consider that a mark in your favor." Evelyn picked up the copies of the filings. She thought about Thomas Reed riding up to the gate with his practiced warmth and his calculation. She thought about Silas Donovan, who she had never met, sitting in this office and implying threats against a woman he knew only as an inconvenience. She thought about a bench in Caldwell Creek Station and a coin that had left a mark in her palm, and a man with a quiet voice who had asked, "How long have you been waiting?" as if the answer mattered to him. She thought, "This is what I came west for. Not Thomas Reed. Not any letter. This." She looked at James. He was looking at her, and he was not hiding what was in his face. Not all the way, not this time. And what she saw, there was something she recognized because it had been growing in her too slowly and without permission, through biscuits made in an early kitchen, and weeds pulled in a summer garden, and documents organized by lamplight, and a hand held in a lawyer's office. She did not name it out loud, but she did not look away from it either. They rode back to the ranch in the long light of a September afternoon, and the north pasture was still there, exactly as it had always been, And Donovan was still out there with his patients and his lawyers and his corruptible allies, and Thomas Reed was somewhere on the road with his calculation and his cold eyes. And none of it was finished. But something had changed. Something that Silas Donovan, for all his money and all his patience, had not accounted for when he'd decided that James Walker was alone. The feed supply didn't come on Thursday. James had ordered it 3 weeks prior. The same order he placed every season from the same merchant in Caldwell Creek he'd done business with for 6 years. He didn't say anything when the wagon didn't arrive. He just looked at the road at noon, and then at 4, and then at dusk, and went inside for dinner without mentioning it. Evelyn mentioned it. "The feed," she said when they were sitting at the table with Clara's soup in front of them. "It didn't come." "No," James said. "Is that unusual?" He picked up his spoon. "Never happened before." She looked at him. He looked at his soup. Neither of them said the name they were both thinking. Hector said it. "Donovan." James nodded once slowly. "Probably." "What do you do for feed in the meantime?" Evelyn asked. "I've got 2 weeks of reserve, maybe 3 if I'm careful." He set down his spoon. "There are other merchants, Billings if it comes to it. But Billings is 4 days out, and the cost doubles when you add the hauling." "Then we go to Billings if we have to," Evelyn said. "It's not just the feed." James's voice was level, but she could hear the weight under it. "If Donovan's put the word out to the merchants, it won't stop at feed. Farrier supplies, timber for the repairs on the north barn, the buyer for my fall cattle." He looked up. "If no buyer will come for the cattle, I don't have operating money for next year. No operating money, and I can't pay Pemberton. Can't pay Pemberton, and the legal case stalls." The table went quiet. This was the machine of it, Evelyn thought. This was how a man like Donovan won without ever doing anything that could be pointed to directly. Not one large blow, but 100 small ones each, ordinary on its own. Each a coincidence. Anyone could argue all of them together, amounting to slow suffocation. "We need to know what he's actually said, and to whom," she said. "Before we can counter it, we need to know its shape." James looked at her. "How do you propose we find that out?" She thought for a moment. "Clara," she said, "when you go to town for provisions, who do you talk to?" Clara tilted her head. "Depends on the day. Mrs. Holt at the dry goods, Ada at the post, sometimes the Garner women." "Women know things," Evelyn said. "They know what their husbands are being told and why and by whom, and they often know before the men have decided what to do about it." She looked at James. "Would you object to Clara and me going to town tomorrow?" James looked at Clara, who looked back at him with an expression that said she had been waiting for someone to ask this. "No objection," he said. They rode in the next morning. Evelyn and Clara together in the buckboard, and they were not subtle about it. They went to the dry goods first, and Mrs. Holt, who was a woman of 60, with a sharp face and kind eyes, looked at Evelyn for a long moment before saying anything. Then she said in a low voice, "You're the woman from Walker's place, the one from back east." "Virginia," Evelyn said. "My name is Evelyn Harper." Mrs. Holt looked at her assessing. "Donovan's man was in here 2 days ago," she said. "He didn't say Walker's name directly. He said there was a land dispute coming to resolution, and that businesses, seen supporting the losing party, might find their own credit arrangements reviewed." She said it with her mouth set in a flat line. "I've been doing business here for 22 years. I don't take well to being told what my credit arrangements ought to be." "But you're uncertain," Evelyn said gently. Mrs. Holt looked at her hands behind the counter. "I have a daughter. Her husband works for Donovan's East operation." She paused. "I'm not uncertain about right and wrong, Miss Harper. I'm uncertain about the cost of right." Evelyn nodded. "That's fair," she said. "That's completely fair." She looked at the woman steadily. "What if Wright had a better chance of winning than Donovan is letting on?" Mrs. Holt looked up. "Does it? We filed a complete legal challenge 6 days ago. We have a statute error that invalidates his notice. We have a federal records request for the original homestead survey that, if it comes back the way we believe it will, establishes Walker's claim beyond any reasonable dispute." She paused. Donovan is pressuring the merchants because he's rattled, not because he's winning. Mrs. Holt was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll send the Garner boy with Walker's feed order this afternoon." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," the woman said. "I'm doing business. Walker pays on time and always has." She looked at Evelyn with something that was almost a smile. "But I'd suggest you talk to Ada at the Post as well. Ada knows everything, and she's got less to lose than most." Ada at the Post was younger and angrier about Donovan in general, and she confirmed what Mrs. Holt had said about the warning to merchants. And she added something new, that Thomas Reed had been in town for the past 5 days, staying at the hotel, and that he'd been seen twice going in and out of the building on Main Street that housed Donovan's land office. Evelyn stood at Ada's counter and felt the information settle into her like cold weight. "Reed and Donovan," she said. "They were at dinner together last night," Ada said. "Public as anything, like they wanted people to see it." She lowered her voice. "Ada's position is that men who want people to see things are generally trying to make you afraid of something." "They want James to know they're coordinated," Evelyn said. "That'd be my reading." She thanked Ada and went back to the buckboard where Clara was waiting, and she told Clara what she'd learned, and Clara drove them home with her jaw tight and her hands steady on the reins, and she didn't say much on the road, which meant she was thinking hard. James was in the yard when they came back. He came to take the horse's head, and he looked at Evelyn's face and said, "What?" "Reed is working with Donovan," she said. "Has been, I think, possibly from before I was ever involved." James went still. "The letters," Evelyn said. "Thomas's letters to me. He knew your name. He knew your land. He was writing to me from an area where everyone knew James Walker and what he owned. I think he targeted me, found a woman in the East through some network. A woman without family. A woman who could be brought west and placed in a situation that could be used." She paused. "I think Donovan told him who to look for and what to do with her once he found her." James's face was doing something controlled and very unpleasant. "That's—" He stopped. "Calculated," she said. "Yes. You weren't just used," he said. "You were moved here, like a piece on a board." "Yes." She said it simply because going soft around it didn't help. "But pieces on a board don't always do what they're supposed to do." She held his gaze. "And I'm not on his board anymore. I'm on mine." James looked at her for a long moment. Then he took a breath and looked at the ground and then back at her, and the anger in his face was still there, but there was something else underneath it, something that she recognized as the particular tenderness of a man who was furious on someone else's behalf. "Evelyn," he said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask? Are you safe here?" He said it directly. "Reed knows where you are. Donovan knows you're involved. I need to know if you want to leave. If you do, I'll take you to Billings myself today, no argument." She looked at him. "Do you want me to leave?" "I want you to be safe." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. Something moved in his face, the door opening again, wider than she'd seen it, and what was behind it was not simple and not comfortable, but it was real, completely real, the way only a few things in her life had ever been. "No," he said quietly. "I don't want you to leave." "Then I'm not leaving," she said. "Not because of Thomas Reed, and not because of Silas Donovan, and not for any other reason than that I am choosing to stay." She stepped closer to him, close enough that she was looking directly up at him. "Don't make my choice for me to protect me. I've had enough of men deciding what's best for me." He looked at her for a moment. Then something in the tension of him shifted, and he nodded. "All right." "All right," she said. The feed arrived that afternoon, as Mrs. Holt had promised. James looked at the wagon coming down the road, and then at Evelyn, and she said nothing, and he said nothing, and the wagon was unloaded and paid for, and that was that. 2 days later, something happened that none of them had expected. A letter arrived from Helena, not the Federal Records response that would take longer. This was a letter from a man named Aldous Crane, who identified himself as a surveyor, retired from the Federal Land Office, who had read of the Walker land dispute through a colleague and wished to offer information relevant to the case. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table with James and Pemberton, who had ridden out from town at James's request, sitting across from her. Crane had conducted the original survey of Donovan's land acquisitions in 1881. He wrote that at the time, the survey had been correct and clean. But he had heard from former colleagues that the survey records submitted to the county office had been altered before filing, specifically the boundary lines adjusted by several feet in key areas to encroach on neighboring properties. He could not prove this without seeing the original field notes, which he still possessed. He still possessed the original field notes. He was willing to submit them to the court if called upon. The kitchen was silent for a full 30 seconds. Then Pemberton said in a very quiet voice, "This changes everything." "It proves the survey was falsified," Evelyn said. "If the field notes match what he's describing, it proves the county records are fraudulent." Pemberton took off his glasses. "This isn't just a land dispute anymore. This is fraud. Criminal fraud." James looked at the letter, then at Evelyn, then at the letter again. "A retired surveyor coming forward," he said slowly. "Why now?" "Because he's heard we're fighting," Evelyn said. "People who have been afraid to speak come forward when they see someone willing to fight." She looked at James. "You've been holding this ground. That matters to people who are watching." Pemberton was already reaching for paper. "I need to write to Crane today. I need those field notes certified and submitted before Donovan has any idea this man exists." He looked at James. "Can I use your table?" "Use whatever you need." While Pemberton wrote, Evelyn went to the window. She stood with her back to the room, and she let herself feel for a moment the full weight of what had just arrived in that envelope. Not just a legal advantage, but proof that Thomas Reed's involvement, Donovan's scheme, all of it had left marks in the world. Evidence. The kind that didn't disappear. James came and stood beside her. I didn't say anything. He just stood there close enough that his arm was almost touching hers, and she let herself lean slightly toward him, just slightly, just enough, and he let her. "It's turning," she said quietly. "Maybe," he said. Careful, not wanting to believe something too early. "It's turning," she said again. Not reckless, just certain. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How are you so sure?" She looked at the yard, at the garden that had come back from the weeds, at the fence she'd watched Hector repair at the east window that had been closed since February and was now open. "Because things that are built right hold," she said. "Your grandfather built that claim right. You've defended it right. We've documented everything right." She turned to look at him. "And Donovan built his on fraud. Fraud has gaps. We just found one." James looked at her. In the clear September light, she could see his face completely, and what was in it was not hidden from her. Not the warmth, not the fear, under the warmth, not the careful, deliberate thing that had been building in him since the day he'd stood in front of a bench in Caldwell Creek and asked a woman how long she'd been waiting. "Evelyn," he said. "James." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "When this is done, don't," she said gently. "Not yet. Finish it first." He looked at her, and she saw him receive that, the patience of it, the rightness of it, and he nodded. "Finish it first," he agreed. Pemberton's letter went to Crane the next morning. Crane's response came within 10 days, faster than any of them had expected. The man had clearly been waiting for exactly this invitation, and with it came a sworn affidavit and a certified copy of his original field notes. Every boundary line recorded in the careful, measured hand of a professional surveyor who had done the work honestly and had spent 3 years watching what happened to that honest work. The differences between Crane's field notes and the survey on file at the county office were not subtle. 12 feet in one location, 9 in another. Small enough to seem like error. Large enough repeated across multiple acquisitions to have transferred thousands of acres that had never belonged to Donovan. Pemberton filed the affidavit and the certified notes with the court on a Wednesday. By Thursday, the story was in the Caldwell Creek Courier. Not the full story. The paper's editor was cautious, and Donovan had relationships there too, but enough. Surveyor's records questioned in Walker land dispute. Former federal surveyor offers testimony in boundary challenge. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear, and in a town where everyone knew Silas Donovan, clear was enough. The reaction was not immediate. Donovan was not the kind of man who reacted immediately to anything. But Evelyn could feel the shift in the air of the town the next time she came in for provisions, in the way Mrs. Holt nodded at her with something brisk and approving, in the way Ada at the post leaned across the counter and said, "I heard about the surveyor." Good in the way that two men on the street who she didn't know tipped their hats as she passed, which they had not done before. She came home and told James, and he listened, and the thing that moved through his face when she described it was something she recognized as the specific emotion of a man who has been isolated long enough to have forgotten that communities could turn toward a person as easily as they could turn away. Then Thomas Reed came back, not to the ranch this time. He came to town, and he did not come quietly. He came to Pemberton's office on a Monday morning with a man. Evelyn had never seen a man in a city suit who turned out to be a lawyer from Billings named Carver, and they presented Pemberton with a document that claimed Evelyn Harper had entered into a binding legal agreement with Thomas Reed in the state of Virginia, and that her presence on James Walker's property constituted a breach of that agreement, and that Reed was suing for damages. Pemberton sent word to the ranch immediately. James and Evelyn rode in together. They sat across from Reed and his Billings lawyer in Pemberton's office, and Evelyn read the document carefully before she said a single word, and when she was done, she set it on the desk and looked at Thomas Reed directly. "A letter," she said. "You're claiming a letter constitutes a binding legal agreement." Reed's lawyer Carver said, "A letter accompanied by reasonable reliance. Miss Harper demonstrably altered her life circumstances in response to the correspondence." "I quit a job," she said. "I packed a bag. I took a train." She kept her eyes on Reed. "And you didn't come." "There were circumstances. Thomas." She said his name quietly. Not angry, just clear. "I know about Donovan. I know what the letters were for. I know why you needed me here, and I know what you plan to do with my presence." She paused. "I'm saying this to you directly with a lawyer on each side of us, so there is no ambiguity later about what was said and when I know what you did." Reed's face did the thing she'd seen it do on the porch, the warmth dropping, the calculation showing through. "You can't prove. I don't need to prove it in this conversation," she said. "It's already in the court record. My account of your arrival at the Walker property, the statements you made, the prior relationship you had with Donovan's land office, it's documented." She looked at the document he'd filed. "And this," she tapped it, "is harassment. It's designed to force me off the property and compromise the Walker legal case. Any judge who reads it alongside the existing court record will see that." Carver said carefully, "Miss Harper, the legal position." "The legal position," Pemberton said, speaking for the first time in several minutes, with the measured precision of a man who has been waiting for exactly the right moment, "is that this filing constitutes potential abuse of process. I will be responding formally, and I will be requesting that the court examine the relationship between Mr. Reed and the opposing party in the Walker case." He looked at Carver. "If you are unaware of your client's full situation, I suggest you take some time to become aware before this proceeds." Carver looked at Reed. Reed looked at the desk. Something in his posture had changed, a subtle deflation. The posture of a man whose plan has just become visible to too many people in too small a room. Evelyn looked at him one last time. "I came west with one trunk and one dime," she said. "I don't have anything you want, Thomas. I never did. The only thing you wanted was to put me where you needed me and move me when you were done." She stood. "I'm not movable." She walked out. James was on her heels, and when the door closed behind them both, and they were standing on Pemberton's porch in the cool October air, she stopped and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. James stood beside her. After a moment he said, "You all right?" "Ask me that again in 5 minutes," she said. He waited. She breathed. The October air was sharp and clean, and it tasted like the coming season, like something finished and something beginning at the same time, and the street of Caldwell Creek moved around them the way it always did, ordinary and constant, and she stood in the middle of it and felt herself, felt the full solid weight of herself in a way she hadn't felt since the bench, since before the bench. "All right," she said after a while. Yeah. She looked at him. "I said what I needed to say." You said it right, he said quietly. She looked down the street. He won't stop entirely. Not yet. No, James agreed. But he's smaller now. She thought about that. Yes, she said. He is. They were walking back to the horses when Pemberton called from his doorway. They turned. He was standing with a piece of paper in his hand that he hadn't had before. This came to my office this morning, he said. I didn't want to present it inside given the company. He came down the steps and handed it to James. The Federal Land Office in Helena responded to our records request. James took it. He read it. His face changed. Evelyn watched his face change and her heart moved. He handed it to her without speaking. The letter confirmed that the original homestead survey filed by John Henry Walker in 1851 had been located in the Federal Archives. It confirmed the boundary descriptions. It confirmed that the north pasture was within those boundaries without any ambiguity. It confirmed that a certified copy had been forwarded to Pemberton's office by registered post. And it contained one additional line that none of them had requested and none of them had expected. The archivist had noted in reviewing the file that a request to examine the same survey had been made 6 months earlier by a surveying firm based in Billings. The same firm. Pemberton confirmed when they showed him that had conducted Donovan's survey of the contested property. Donovan's people had looked at James's original survey before filing their claim. They had known exactly where the real boundary was. They had filed anyway. Evelyn read the letter twice, and then she looked at James, and James looked at her, and Pemberton stood with his hands clasped in front of him, like a man at church. He knew, she said. He knew, James said. That's not just fraud, Pemberton said quietly. That's knowing willful fraud, filed in direct knowledge of the prior claim. He paused. That is a criminal matter. The October street of Caldwell Creek went about its business around them. A dog crossed the road. A woman came out of the dry goods with a paper-wrapped parcel. 2 men argued cheerfully over the price of something at the far end of the block. And Evelyn Harper stood in the middle of all of it, holding a letter from the federal government that said what she had known was true. What James had known was true, was documented and proven and real. She looked at James. I was looking at her with the expression fully open. Now the door, all the way open. Not a crack. Not almost. And what was behind it was everything she had suspected, and more than she had let herself hope for. And it was frightening, and it was true. And it was the realest thing she had encountered since she'd gotten on a train in Virginia with a blue dress and a trunk, and an idea about what love was supposed to look like. She reached out and took the letter back gently. We need to get this to the courthouse, she said. Today, before end of business. Yes, he said. His voice was not quite steady. James. She looked at him. It's going to be all right. He looked at her. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. Not once in the weeks she'd known him. He smiled. Not the almost smile, not the corner of the mouth shape that might become a smile. A real one. Full and unguarded and entirely completely his. I know, he said. I know it is. They walked to the courthouse together, and behind them Pemberton followed with his files, and the October sun was warm on the backs of their shoulders, and the north pasture was waiting for them back home, solid and patient and real. The certified copy of the federal survey arrived at Pemberton's office on a Thursday, 4 days after their visit to the courthouse. Pemberton rode out to the ranch himself to deliver it, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about how significant he considered it. He came in the late morning, tied his horse at the post, and came into the kitchen where James and Evelyn were sitting with coffee, and he set the envelope on the table between them without ceremony. Open it, he said. James opened it. The certified copy was exactly what the letter had promised the original survey in John Henry Walker's handwriting. The boundaries described in the careful, measured language of a man who had walked every inch of that land himself and marked what he'd found. The north pasture was there named and bounded and documented in ink that was 73 years old and still legible in a hand that James looked at for a long moment before setting the paper flat on the table. That's his writing, James said quietly. My grandfather's. Nobody said anything for a moment. Evelyn looked at James's face. He was looking at the document the way a man looked at something he'd been told existed, but had never quite let himself believe he'd hold. She understood, looking at him, that this was not just a legal document. It was his grandfather's hand reaching forward through 73 years to say, "I was here. I built this. It is yours." She looked away, because some moments were not hers to witness fully. Pemberton cleared his throat. "With this and Crane's affidavit, I'm filing a motion for summary judgment next week. I believe the case is strong enough that Donovan's attorneys will advise him to withdraw before it reaches a full hearing." He paused. Men like Donovan calculate odds. The odds have changed considerably. "You think he'll walk away?" James said. "I think he'll look at what's in front of him. Criminal fraud exposure, a federal survey that contradicts his own filed claim, a retired federal surveyor willing to testify in open court, and a documented pattern of manipulated records across 3 other properties. And I think his lawyers will tell him that the cost of continuing is higher than whatever he'd gain from the pasture." Pemberton folded his hands. "He's a patient man, as you've said. Patient men know when to cut losses." "And the other properties?" Evelyn asked. "The ranchers who already sold to him under this scheme?" Pemberton looked at her. "That," he said carefully, "is a matter for the territorial prosecutor. It is not a matter I can pursue directly. But if a formal fraud finding comes out of the Walker case, the prosecutor would be obligated to investigate." He paused. "I have already had an informal conversation with his office." Evelyn nodded. She looked at James. He was looking at her with an expression that recognized what she'd just done. Asked the question. Not for them, but for the people who'd already lost the ones who'd sold, because Donovan had made staying impossible. The ones who weren't at this table. He reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers. Just briefly, just a moment, and he took it back and looked at Pemberton. "File the motion." "Motion," he said. "Whatever you need from me, you've got it." Pemberton left an hour later, and the ranch went back to its work, and the morning passed. But something had shifted in the air of the place, something lighter, something that had been pressing down for months and had lifted by a fraction. Evelyn felt it in the kitchen at noon, when Clara hummed something while she cooked, which Clara did not do when she was worried. She felt it in the yard when Hector whistled at the cattle in the old way. He had the way he'd stopped sometime in August when the pressure started. Small things. The particular music of people who are beginning to believe something is going to be all right. 3 days later, Reed left town. Ada at the post sent word, not a letter, just a message through Mrs. Holt's boy, quick and informal. Reed checked out of the hotel this morning, heading east. That was all. No explanation, no drama. Just gone the way men who'd made bad calculations went when the calculation became undeniable. Evelyn received the message at the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment. She felt not relief exactly. Something more complex. She had known Thomas Reed only as an idea for 8 months and as a face for 15 minutes. And the idea had been built so carefully, so specifically out of words, she'd wanted to be true. Setting it down completely was not simple, even when setting it down was exactly right. James came in from outside and saw her face. "Reed," she said before he could ask. "He's gone." James sat down across from her. He didn't say good, or "I told you so," or any of the things that would have been easy and slightly wrong. He said, "How are you with that?" She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to do with him, no performance, just the actual answer. "I'm glad," she said. "And I'm sad a little, but not for him. For the story I had about him that wasn't real." She looked at the table. "It was a good story. I believed it completely. And there's something that hurts about giving up a story you believed in, even when the story was a lie." "Yes," he said, simply, like he knew exactly what that was. She looked up. "What was yours?" He looked at her steadily. "Collins," he said. "We were going to build something together. I had a story about what that looked like." He left, and the story went with him, and the hurt wasn't only losing Collins. It was losing the version of the future that had Collins in it. He was quiet a moment. "Took me a long time to understand those were 2 separate things. The person and the story. And you could grieve the story without it meaning the person deserved more grief than they'd earned. Evelyn looked at him across the table. "James," she said, "you should know something." "All right." "The story I had about Thomas Reed, what I wanted from it that wasn't wrong. What I wanted was real. A partner. Someone to build something with. Someone who chose me specifically, not generally." She held his gaze. "The story was wrong, but the wanting wasn't. I don't want to give up the wanting because the story failed." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. His hands were on the table, and she could see the roughness of them. The hands of a man who'd worked this land for 8 years, who'd built and repaired and planted and buried people he loved in it. The hands of a man who built things. "No," he said quietly. "Don't give that up." The motion for summary judgment was filed the following Tuesday. Donovan's response came not through the court, but through a messenger who arrived at the ranch on Friday morning with a letter sealed in fine paper that bore the letterhead of Donovan's attorney in Helena. Evelyn and James read it together at the kitchen table. It was a settlement offer. Donovan was withdrawing all claims to the North Pasture. He was offering a modest sum, insultingly modest, Evelyn thought, as compensation for the period of disruption to ranch operations. He was requesting in return that James Walker agree not to pursue further legal action and not to make public statements about the nature of the dispute. Evelyn read the last part twice. Then she set the letter down. "He wants silence," she said. "He wants this buried," James said. "He's not offering to make it right. He's offering to make it quiet." She looked at James. "If you sign this, the other ranchers he defrauded stay defrauded. The prosecutor's informal inquiry goes nowhere. Donovan goes back to being patient, and he tries it with someone else in 2 years." James looked at the letter. "I know. What do you want to do?" Howe was quiet for a moment, and she let him be quiet, because this was his land, and his grandfather's name, and his decision in a way that it was not hers, and she would not make it for him. Then he said, "I want Pemberton to write back. No settlement. We proceed." She felt something settle in her chest, like a stone finding its level. "Are you sure? Those other ranchers didn't have Crane's affidavit," he said. "They didn't have someone who knew which statute to look at. They lost because they didn't have what we have, and the only reason we have it is because—" He stopped. He looked at her directly. "Because you stayed. Because you read the document. Because you knew what to look for." He paused. "If you hadn't stayed, I'd have lost this too. I'd probably be signing something like this right now and not understanding what I was giving away." His voice was level, but she could hear everything under it. "So no, we don't sign. We go forward. And if it comes out the other side the way Pemberton thinks it will, those other ranchers get their chance at it too." Evelyn picked up the settlement letter and folded it precisely and set it aside. "I'll ride to Pemberton's this afternoon," she said. "We'll ride," he said. Pemberton received the news of the rejected settlement with a satisfaction he was too professional to express openly, but not quite disciplined enough to entirely conceal. He drafted the rejection letter that afternoon while they waited, and it was a masterpiece of legal language. Every word of it, clear, every word of it, leaving no exit. For Donovan to claim ambiguity, and in the final paragraph, a formal notice that Walker intended to provide full cooperation to any investigation by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office into the pattern of land fraud described in the case record. It was, Pemberton said, his way of making sure Donovan understood the dimensions of what he'd chosen to continue. They rode home in the early evening, and the October light was doing the thing it did in Montana in the fall, going long and amber and making everything it touched look like something worth keeping. Evelyn rode beside James on the second horse Hector had been training her on since August, and she sat it better now than she had in July, and James had noticed without commenting on it, which was his way. They rode in comfortable quiet for several miles. Then James said, "I need to say something." She looked at him. "I've been trying to find the right time for it," he said. "I don't think there's a right time. I think I've been using the land situation as a reason to wait, when the truth is, I'm just not a man who finds these things easy to say." Her heart was doing something specific and deliberate in her chest. She kept her face neutral and her voice even. "Say it then." He looked at the road. "When I went to that station, I wasn't looking for anything. I want you to know that. I went because Pruitt asked someone to, and I was the only someone who said yes. That's all it was." He paused. "And then I saw you on that bench, and something happened that I don't entirely know how to describe, except that it felt like recognition. Like looking at something I'd seen before in a place I hadn't expected to find it." He shook his head slightly. "I'm not saying that well." "You're saying it fine," she said quietly. "You've been here 3 months," he said. "And in 3 months, you've fixed the chair and the garden and the east fence and the way I think about the paperwork on this land. You've stood in a lawyer's office and said things to Thomas Reed that needed to be said and that I didn't have the words for. You've—" He stopped. He looked at her directly, which was harder on horseback, but he managed it. "You've made this place the kind of place I wanted it to be when I built it, and I didn't know until you did it that it hadn't been that before." Evelyn said nothing. She let him finish. "I'm not Thomas Reed," he said. "I can't write a letter like that to save my life. I'm not going to promise you things I can't see clearly enough to promise. But I can tell you what I know, and what I know is that I don't want you to leave. Not in a week, not in a season." He looked ahead at the road. "Not ever if you'd have it that way." The horses walked. The light went amber. Somewhere over the north pasture, a hawk circled in that patient, certain way she'd watched since July, knowing exactly what it was looking for. She said, "I came west with a story about what love looked like." "I know. I want to tell you what I think it actually looks like," she said. "Not from the story, from the last 3 months." She looked ahead too, because it was easier to say some things without looking directly at the person you were saying them to. "It looks like a man who tells you the lock is on the inside of the door. It looks like not asking questions you don't have the right to yet. It looks like crouching in a garden without being asked. It looks like someone who gets angry on your behalf and holds it in because expressing it wouldn't help you." She paused. "It looks like you, specifically, not generally." Howe was quiet. "I'm not a woman who needs saving," she said. "I never was. I needed a place where what I was worth could be seen and time enough to see it myself." She looked at him now. "You gave me that. I'm not confusing gratitude for something else. This is something else." James Walker pulled his horse to a stop on the road, and she pulled hers up too, and they sat there with the October light falling around them, and the north pasture visible in the distance, and the ranch behind them, and nothing particular happening, except the thing that had been happening for 3 months, finally being said out loud. "Is that a yes?" he asked. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, not uncertainty, not quite, but the particular roughness of a man asking a question that matters completely. "It's a yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, with the full, open expression she'd come to know. Then he did something simple. He reached across the distance between the horses and took her hand and held it, and they rode the rest of the way home like that. The court ruled 6 weeks later. Pemberton called it before the ruling came. He'd heard from a colleague in the territorial capital that Donovan's Helena attorneys had petitioned to have the case transferred to federal jurisdiction, which was the legal equivalent of a man looking for a door that wasn't there. The petition was denied. The summary judgment hearing proceeded. The ruling was complete and unambiguous. The Walker homestead claim was upheld. Donovan's competing survey was declared fraudulent, the filing invalidated. The court further referred the matter to the territorial prosecutor, citing Crane's affidavit and the documented pattern across 3 other properties. Evelyn read the ruling in Pemberton's office with James on one side of her and Pemberton on the other, and Hector standing by the door, because he'd insisted on riding in with them. And when she finished reading, she set it down on the desk and looked at James, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment wasn't already saying. Then Hector from the door said, "I'm going to tell Clara." Hector, I was already gone. They could hear him in the street. Pemberton shook James's hand. He shook Evelyn's hand too, with both of his, which she understood was not his standard practice. "In 20 years of law," he said, "I have not had a case turn the way this one turned." He looked at Evelyn specifically. "Because of you, Miss Harper. The statute, the settlement rejection, all of it." "Because of the records," she said. "My father was right about records." "Your father," Pemberton said, "would be very proud. She accepted that. She held it. She let it be true. 3 weeks after the ruling, one of the defrauded ranchers, a man named Alderton, who'd sold his eastern parcel 2 years prior, came to see them. He drove out to the ranch himself, a tired-looking man of 55, with the particular dignity of someone who has been defeated by something unfair and has carried it quietly. He sat at the kitchen table with James and Evelyn and Clara, and he said he'd heard about the case from the prosecutor's office, who'd reached out to the other affected property owners. He said he didn't know if he'd get his land back. He said the legal situation was complicated, and the prosecutor had been honest with him about that. But he said that the fraud was now documented, and that what he'd signed had been signed under false pretenses, and that made it invalid, and that meant for the first time in 2 years he had ground to stand on. He looked at Evelyn when he said this last part. He looked at her the way people looked at someone who had done something they didn't know how to quantify. "I heard it was you who found the statute error," he said. "I read the document carefully," she said. "My wife," he said slowly. It's been hard on her. Losing the land. Feeling like there was nothing to be done." He stopped. "I'd like to be able to tell her that something's being done." "Tell her," Evelyn said. "Something is being done." He nodded, and he didn't trust himself to say more, and she understood that, and she didn't push for more. After he left, James sat at the table for a long time. Clara had gone out. Hector was at the barn. The kitchen was just the two of them, and the quietness of a house in mid-November. The stove burning the windows, all of them open in summer, and now shut against the cold, but properly shut weather-tight, in the way they hadn't been when she'd arrived. "He'll get his land back," James said. "Maybe not all of it," Evelyn said, "but some. Because of what you found. Because we didn't sign the settlement." She looked at him. "That was you." "We," he said, quietly, firmly. "We didn't sign it." She looked at her hands on the table. He covered them with his, both of them, the way he'd learned to do in the months since October, not tentative anymore, not brief, just present. She thought about the bench in Caldwell Creek Station, the coin in her palm, the hawk overhead that knew what it was looking for. She thought about the blue dress gone gray with dust, and the biscuits she'd made her first morning in this kitchen, and the way the east fence had leaned before Hector fixed it, and the chair with the broken back leg, and the garden that had come back from the weeds. She thought about the letter from the federal land office, and the word fraud, written in a court document, and a tired man named Alderton, who could now go home and tell his wife that something was being done. She thought about all of it as a shape, not a story that had been told to her, but one she had walked into with her own feet, and stayed in by her own choosing, and that she had helped bend page by page, and statute by statute, and documented date by documented date towards something true. James said, "I want to ask you something." She looked up. "Earlier this fall," he said, "I asked if you'd have it staying, not leaving. You said yes." He held her gaze with the full open expression that was simply his face, now the way she knew his face. "I want to ask it more precisely." She waited. "Evelyn Harper," he said, "will you stay on this land, with me, as mine and I as yours?" He said it the way he said everything important, plain and direct, without ornament, with the full weight of meaning in every word, because there were no extra words to dilute it. "Not out of arrangement, not out of circumstance." He paused. "Because you want this." She looked at him. At this man who had asked how long she'd been waiting, who had told her the lock was on the inside of the door, who had crouched in the dirt of a weedy garden, without being asked, who had held her hand in a lawyer's office, and on a road in October, and across a kitchen table in November, and who had never, not once, asked her to be less than what she was. "I want this," she said. "I want you. I want this land and this kitchen and that garden and the north pasture that your grandfather built, and the east fence that needed fixing." She felt her voice steady and warm, and entirely her own. "I want Hector who won't go near a vegetable on principle, and Clara who always makes enough. I want the biscuits in the morning, and the porch in the evening, and every hard thing that comes with keeping a real life." She looked at him without looking away. "I want it because it's real. Because I know what it costs, and I know what it gives back, and I know who you are inside all of it." She paused. "Yes, James. I'll stay." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and came around the table, and she stood too, and he took her face in his work-roughed hands very carefully, the way a man held something he intended to keep, and she put her hands over his, and they stood in the kitchen of the house he'd built on the land his grandfather had claimed and she had chosen to belong to. The first snow came that night, not heavy. The first snow of the season. Never was just the beginning of things. A reminder that the world turned and the seasons came and went, and the land remained. James checked the cattle before first light the way he always did, and Evelyn made biscuits in the kitchen the way she always did. And Clara came in from the small house she and Hector kept, and hung her coat, and took up her place at the stove, and Hector stamped his boots at the door, and came in and sat at the table and looked at the biscuits. "First snow," he said. "First snow." James agreed, sitting down. Evelyn poured coffee and set the biscuits on the table, and sat in her chair. Her chair, the one she'd claimed in her first week without naming it, and everyone had accepted without comment, and she looked at the four of them around this table. She thought of what she'd been looking for when she left Virginia. A partner. Someone to matter to specifically. Something real to build. She had been looking in the right direction. She had simply been handed false directions to get there, and she had walked far enough in the wrong direction to end up by accident and by choice, and by the ordinary miracle of a man who said yes when a station master asked if someone could help exactly where she needed to be. This was not the life she'd been promised. It was better. It was hers. Later that morning, when the snow had stopped and the light was coming clean and cold over the North Pasture. John Henry Walker's North Pasture, established 1851, upheld 1884, belonging to James Walker, and to anyone James Walker chose to share it with. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched James cross the yard. He stopped below the window and looked up at her. Just for a moment. He tipped his hat. She pressed her hand to the glass. He smiled, that full, unguarded, entirely his smile, and walked on. She watched him go, this quiet man who built things, and she thought, I was not waiting to be saved. I was waiting to arrive. And she had arrived. Not where she'd planned. Not how she'd imagined. But here, with her own hands and her own mind and her own choosing, she had arrived. And the word for where she stood she knew now with the clarity of someone who had been without it and recognized it when she found it was not temporary, was not arrangement, was not circumstance.